Hello and welcome back to Ancient History. Today we are going to be looking at Hellenic and Egyptian influences at Pompeii and Herculaneum. Now, I strongly recommend that you download the sheets that were given to you with this file, okay? In particular, you are going to need one. I'll show you what it is. Let's see if I can get it right. This one, okay? And this one is going to basically be helping you to write down all of your notes for this lesson, okay? So we're going to be looking at the influence of Egypt and Greece in three different areas: art, architecture, and religion, okay? Now, keep in mind, Egyptian's pretty easy. Always remember, we rarely say Greek in anything regards to ancient history because we don't have a Greek national identity yet. What we have is a Hellenic cultural identity, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the PowerPoint that we have together, and then we are going to look at all of this stuff. So let's have a look, okay? Egyptian influence in Pompeii and Herculaneum, looking at art, architecture, and religion. So when we're looking at art, okay, Egyptian art existed in Herculaneum and Pompeii in many varying forms, such as statues, frescoes, mosaics, and wall paintings. Now, we've seen a lot of the sort of Greek or Hellenic-inspired art already. For example, when we look at the House of the Fallen, we can see the massive mosaic of Alexander the Great, but we haven't seen so much of the Egyptian style, okay? Now, this shows the popularity and possible trade between Alexandria and the Campania regions. Now, do keep in mind, when Pompeii and Herculaneum were destroyed, there was significant amounts of trade between Egypt and Pompeii and Herculaneum. The reason being is that Egypt at this time was a Roman province. It was also the breadbasket of the empire. So most of the empire's food came from that region. There's a lot of trade going on between them, okay, and a lot of exchanging of ideas. Now, painting of frescoes on walls was also a practice that originated in the Egyptian world and was adopted in the Roman Empire. So we actually say the Roman Empire did a lot of these things. A lot of people sort of leveled their criticism at the Roman Empire in that they didn't actually invent many things, but they were really good at stealing stuff from everybody else. It's both true and not true. They did invent a lot of things, but they certainly took a lot of things from other cultures and then made it a bit more commercialized and bigger. Most depicted Egyptian mythology, landscapes, animals, and various religious scenes. Okay, so you can see here, obviously, the hippopotamus is not native to the Italian region. So this is art that has been taken over from Egypt, or at least the influences of it. Okay. We have these ideas of Egyptian gods and goddesses coming about, along with other mythological figures, okay? Now, when we're looking at frescoes in particular, in both towns, frescoes have been discovered depicting Egyptian mythology, religious rites, and landscapes. Frescoes were an important part of everyday life, showing exotic landscapes and religious scenes. So, for example, we can see this is taken from the Temple of Isis in Pompeii. We can see that the women are dressed in sort of foreign clothing. We can also see these sort of mythological figures appearing sort of as departers of information or knowledge, okay? And then we can also see the hues and colours on this one are decidedly foreign. We can see dark-skinned individuals who are acting as priests as well as priestesses. And we can also see at the very bottom there, two little ibises that act as symbols for the goddess Isis and also Osiris. Now, keep in mind that Osiris is a bit of a tricky one when we're talking about him in Pompeii and Herculaneum, because he does also sometimes have an alternative name, a Hellenic name, which is Serapis. So, let's have a look at the House of the Fallen, which we were talking about before. Now, mosaics in the House of the Fallen include a floor mosaic portraying the Battle of Isis. Okay, so this was that very famous one that we spent a large part of that lecture last time looking at, and it's important that you remember it. Now, of course, please remember that this would have typically been found on the floor in the House of the Fawn, but it has been removed from the floor and put on the walls so people can better display it and also better protect it. Okay. Now, what does this mosaic actually show? Well, it also indicates communication between Egypt and Campania, and was done by skilled Alexandrian craftsmen. Okay. Now, there's a bit of debate about whether it was done by Alexandrian craftsmen, okay, but certainly it would have been inspired by their works. Okay, now another mosaic was found of the Nile River and many exotic creatures that can be found there. Also keep in mind the other lesson when we were looking at the Temple of Isis, keep in mind what was hidden underneath the Temple of Isis, which was water stored from the River Nile. Now, all of these mosaics that are these frescoes and things like that, apologies, okay, these are all things that are sort of coming back to Egypt as this sort of holy land, and people that might have had this in this house could have been belonged to the cult of Isis and things like that, and this is their sort of way of paying homage. So let's have a look at this statue of Isis. Okay, well, a stylistic analysis has indicated a statue of Isis found in a temple of Isis combine the typical elements of archaic Greek art and Egyptian art. Now, similar statuettes have been found throughout Herculaneum, although of a much smaller scale. This indicates that a combination of Egyptian and Greek art was popular in the design of statues. Now, when you think about it, that's not exactly surprising that Egyptian and Greek art or Hellenic art was mixing, because even before the Romans controlled Egypt as a province of the empire, the Egyptians themselves were not in control of it. It was controlled by the Hellenic family called the Ptolemies, who are the successors of Alexander the Great. So the Hellenics have been in control of the Egyptian world for quite some time by the time it comes into the Egyptian Empire, into the Roman Empire. And of course, their cultures are beginning to fuse. And a really good way of looking at that is, for example, the god Serapis. Serapis is based off the Egyptian god Osiris, and it's sort of their spin on it. Now, looking at architecture, well, Egyptian architecture was not recognized as greatly in Pompeii and Herculaneum, as it was tended to be more East Hellenistic architecture, which was after the influence of the Greeks during Alexander the Great's reign, although the influence of East Hellenistic was great. So let's think about that for a while. And why might you see a lot more of Hellenistic or Greek architecture than you would Egyptian ones? Well, let's figure out how the cult of Isis, for example, was brought into Pompeii and Herculaneum and the wider Italian peninsula. The cult of Isis was brought in primarily through slaves, predominantly through women. Okay, these are not two groups that have particularly high social or political standings. Okay, yes, they do infiltrate those sort of higher levels, and we do see some higher social stratas embracing the cult of Isis, but it largely does remain a sort of more a lower born affair. Now, let's consider this to the Hellenistic influence. Well, to be Greek or Hellenistic at this point was something to be cultured and also rich. So you are going to see a lot more Hellenistic architecture in these very famous in these very rich houses run by the rich people, because they want to display that they are these cultured people and they're Greek and things like that, or at least they've read all the great classics. Unlike the Egyptian one, where it's sort of more of a sordid, low-born affair. Okay, it doesn't mean that no nobles or equivalents of it were in the cult of Isis. It just means that people generally get that one on the down low. Okay. And you can definitely see mosaics and frescoes of the cult of Isis in other people's houses. Just keep in mind, it's on the download. So house structures. Well, the House of the Fawn is a perfect example of the influence of Hellenistic culture. It introduced high vestibules, wide atriums and peristyles, extremely large gardens, as well as libraries and picture galleries. Okay. Now, when we're looking at that, that's a really important one. We've looked at the House of the Fawn's layout before. And one of the things that you really should be getting from it is that it's massive atrium and peristyles, as well as the tetrastyle peristyles as well. This is a house that is screaming iron Hellenic influence, because the owner wants to convey that. They want to convey that they are an influential and cultural person. Okay. Now, when we're looking at religion, okay, which we've been looking at for the past 2 lessons, it's important to remember the influence of the mystery or the foreign Eastern cults, okay? Now, when we're looking at the mystery cults, we are looking at things like the cult of Dionysius, the cult of Isis, the cult of Serapis, or the cult of Sabazius, okay? So one of the first buildings rebuilt after the 62 AD earthquake was the Temple of Isis, which depicts the importance of the Egyptian influence cult. Now, that's quite an important one because you've got to remember that the Temple of Jupiter was actually, or the Temple of the Capitoline Triad was still being repaired when we got to the eruption. So the fact that the Temple of Isis was repaired before that goes to tell us that they probably had some pretty important sponsors for the cult of Isis. I would also argue that the cult of Temple of Isis was a bit smaller, so probably a bit easier to repair. Okay. Now, what are we finding inside those? Well, shrines, paintings, frescoes, statues, and mosaics unearthed throughout Pompeii and Herculaneum demonstrate the importance of religion and worship in their everyday lives. Not only was it important to maintain favour and prosperity, it was also heavily embedded into the culture of the Pompeians and Herculaneans. Now, keep in mind, as we've said multiple times before in the ancient world, religion and state are 2 things that are combined at this point. And it was public duties by Romans that actually, it was your duty to be religious. Because if you weren't religious and the proper religious rites weren't observed, then you're basically inviting disaster upon the empire. And emperors and senators have actually been killed because they've done certain religious rituals wrong, or because the people felt that they weren't religious enough and they've brought disaster down upon them. Now, this can also apply to the foreign cults. As we were saying before, the religious Roman cult tended to be rather impersonal as a series of legal structures, but these foreign cults allowed people these sort of chance of redemption, resurrection, things like that. And the Romans adopted them quite quickly because they like that personal relationship with the gods. But they bring their sort of old Roman traditions and basically say, these are very specific rituals that we have to do, and you have to do them exactly like this. So looking at the Temple of Isis specifically, the Temple of Isis was an important structure in Pompeii, as noted by the fact that it was one of the first structures rebuilt after the earthquake of 62 AD. It also appears that extensions were made during the rebuilding, indicating a growing number of worshippers. So not only was it a relatively large temple, it was one that kept on growing as well. The temple was also open every day for worship, and 2 worships occurred daily. Many frescoes and paintings adorned the walls, showing rites and practices. And that's a relatively foreign thing in Roman religion for the temples to be open every single day and also available for normal people to go inside worshiping them. As we know, most of the Roman worship was done in the lares at home or the home altars. In the Temple of Isis, they're sort of wanting you to have this sort of communal experience. Now, many frescoes and paintings adorn the walls, showing the rites and practices. We also have evidence of carbonized remains in pits and around the altar that illustrate that sacrifices took place in the temple. Okay. So Temple of Isis, very big Egyptian influence in Pompeii and Herculaneum. Now, when we're looking at gods, okay, well, the House of the Gilded Cupids featured a chapel dedicated to Isis, Serapis, and Anubis. The Temple of Isis also hosted paintings of the Egyptian gods Harpocrates, and statues of other gods were found, indicating a variety of Egyptian worship. So what does this tell us? Well, it actually tells us that these people, the Romans and Pompeii and Herculaneum, were actually bringing these foreign gods home to them inside their own lardis and things like that. So it's meaning that it's not just this sort of communal thing where you go and do it in the temple alone. No. It's a personal relationship with the gods. You are bringing them home. And this is showing that the Greek and Egyptian influence is not just out in the public square, it's also in the private square as well, in people's personal lives. So that's all we have at the moment for Hellenistic art and Hellenistic and Egyptian art, architecture, and religion. I would strongly advise you to read the chapter. There we go. Eventually got there. The chapter from Cities of Vesuvius. Okay, it's a short chapter, but it's a good one. And when you're thinking about these sort of influences, you really want to divide it into those three things: art, architecture, religion. Have examples for all three of those columns, things that you can call on. And when someone asks you, okay, well, what's the example of Egyptian influence in Pompeii or Herculaneum? You want to be able to quickly vomit out and go, this is all the answers. Keep in mind, you have to be specific about where that influence has come from. So for example, if you're looking in the House of the Faun, you have to say, for example, we can see that Hellenistic influence was present in Pompeii, specifically Pompeii, through the House of the Faun. Okay? I will stop recording there. Now, I would advise you to go through that chapter, complete any of the readings that are attached to this, and I will see you again next time. Have a good day.